Okay. Now we're gonna get to the second part of the lecture. So in the first part, we talked about this idea that Hardwig has, and that now I guess many people have, that we can't do like the Enlightenment thinkers think we should, think about everything ourselves. We need the expertise of others. But then the question arises, which experts should we trust? There seem to be a lot around. And this maybe wasn't so evident in 1984 when Hardwig wrote. It certainly was very evident already in the early 2000s when Goldman wrote, and it's even more evident now. It's easy to find a lot of information about various things everywhere. Whether it's the internet, there's what people say on Facebook, there's people what you say on WhatsApp, Instagram, and so on. There's millions of books being published. The Statistics Central Bureau publishes things. There's textbooks. Lots of things. Then, of course, you can read the Bible, you can read the Quran, you can try and you can look at lexicons, and so on and so forth. It's very easy to find information. But there's also, of course, QAnon's publications are among those too. There's easy to find information. There's various experts. There are we are on online. You find our my philosophy colleagues and my friend Anders Schnees in Trondheim. You can ask various friends about various things. There's people like internet personalities like Jordan Peterson, and the various books, good or bad, that you find in the stores. There's TED Talks you can watch. There's your teachers, us, that you can listen to. Lots of apparent experts around. The question then arises, which of those various people who seem to be experts on things should we trust? Now, a brief interlude in the epistemology of testimony. Okay, so because that's important. Now, most philosophers today believe that it is, like Hardwig, believe that it is possible to get knowledge on the basis of what others say. And that's often called their testimony. I mean, that sounds like it's in court where the people give testimony, but in philosophy it's used generally. That's just what someone says, and to us, someone tells us, that's their testimony. Now, in the article, Goldman briefly reviews a debate between so-called reductionists and anti-reductionists about justification of our beliefs on the basis of testimony. So the reductionists, they try to show that relying on testimony, so when we hear someone says, that can be justified on independent grounds, that they somehow, for example, we can show that it's a reliable method. Whereas the anti-reductionists are those that hold that the testimony of others is a completely independent and fundamental source of knowledge. It's like as fundamental as observation, as fundamental as reasoning by logic, so on, is to rely on testimony of others. So these anti-reductionists, they typically think that the mere fact that I hear you say P, well, let's say sun's shining outside, that makes it rational for me to believe that the sun is shining outside, whether or not you're an expert. So merely, but the fact that merely someone says it is a reason to believe it, or makes it at least rational for me to believe it. Okay. Now, you might so Hardwig is someone who might you can think of him as an anti-reductionist. So he thinks that you don't need any, and can't get indeed any independent evidence in order to have a reason to rely on what others say, in order to have reasons for belief or knowledge. Okay, so for him it's like it's fine to just if someone says something, then you have reason, and if they have reasons to believe it, then you can get reasons to believe it too. Now, that if you so here's why this why Goldman talks about this somewhat sort of rather obscure issue about anti-reductionism and reductionism, that you would think, well, why is that relevant? Well, here's why it's relevant. Because if the anti-reductionist is right, that we can get knowledge on the basis of what someone says just by them saying it, then it might seem we have an easy answer to our question, which experts trust. All of them. I mean, we should trust everyone. Isn't that right? I mean, when someone says the sun's shining, then we have a reason to believe the sun is shining. For everyone, experts or not. Also for the drunk people at the party, if they say the sun is shining, that gives us that makes the rational believe it too. That's the anti-reductionist stance. So it seems like, well, there would be an easy answer to this question. Should we trust, at least the anti-reductionist, right? Trust everyone. Now, Goldman argues that doesn't actually answer our question. So Hardwig's position that we have reason to believe things on the basis of what others say doesn't answer the question, who should we trust? And the reason is that even the anti-reductionists hold that the justification of the reasons we get for believing things on the basis of what others say can be either bolstered or defeated. So suppose you have this party and they say, I don't know, they say something about mathematics, okay, this person. Now, it might turn out that that person turns out to be a math professor. He didn't look like it, but she's a math professor. In that case, the fact that she said it certainly seems to be boosted. That makes it better reason to believe it. But it also can be defeated. Suppose that this math kind of sentence comes out of the mouth of someone who you later find out was on an acid trip while he said it. Then it seems like that downgrades that reason. So what Goldman argues that our overall justification for our beliefs on the basis of what others say will depend on various factors. Even if you think, even like an anti-reductionist, that the mere fact that they said it gives the initial push that says, oh yeah, it's okay to believe it, they can be downgrades and upgrades for it. So we can then reformulate for the anti-reductionist this question as, what is a good reason to bolster and what's a good reason to defeat expert testimony? Because which things count? Which things put you in the category of like the guy on the acid trip, which things put you in the category of the person turns out to be a professor. Okay, now when reading Goldman's article, it's important to pay attention to the way he defines what it is to be an expert in some domain. That itself can be something that one can discuss. So for him, someone is an expert in a domain if they possess what he calls an extensive fund of knowledge or true beliefs in the relevant domain, and a set of skills and method for deploying that knowledge to answer new questions about the domain. Okay. So it's someone who is an expert, has knowledge, and he can use that knowledge to answer new questions about this. So now the point here that's important is that on this definition, everyone who's in fact an expert will be a good source of knowledge. So it is a good thing always to rely on experts, because experts on this understanding are people who know a lot of things. The question for the person who's trying to find out on the basis of who to trust is who is in fact an expert. So there are lots of people walking around who seem to be experts, who write about things, who have YouTube channels, who have Twitter accounts, who appear on WhatsApp, who are at university, which of these apparent experts in the domain is the ones that are most credible? Which ones should I use to form my beliefs about the domain? So that's then the question. There's lots of apparent experts walking around, for example, having various opinions about the spread of the coronavirus, having various opinions about the efficacy of various vaccines, having various opinions about the causes of poverty, having various opinions about the causes of cancer, and so on and so forth. There's people who claim to be experts. Which ones should we trust? There's also a slightly different question that I want to call your attention to. There's sometimes also an interesting question. If I have a question, it's sometimes not so clear which domain that question really belongs to. And then, so we had this discussion about, is this a scientific or is this a philosophical question? So sometimes that can also arise. It's not obvious which domain, who is the expert. There can be the question about a question about which domain of expertise is this are we talking about here? I'm just fixing something here. All right, and I wanted to think about that, whether Goldman's discussion really helps here as well. Okay, so here's the basic problem that I, as a novice who's not an expert, has. So what's my problem? The problem is that there are several apparent experts who say incompatible things. Suppose one expert said, these AstraZeneca vaccines, they aren't really safe. Well, the other expert says, no, the AstraZeneca vaccines are perfectly safe. The problem is that I don't have the expertise or the capacity to evaluate who actually knows more about this expert domain, because I'm not an expert. I can only understand that they say these incompatible things, but I don't understand the evidence, and so I don't know who's right. Okay, that's the basic problem. Now, it's important to apparent experts. There can be various sort of apparent experts, and they come up with all kinds of things. They might not dress up in a lab coat, and someone, like QAnon might have to say something, has something to say about vaccines too. They have all kinds of opinions about various other things, about Trump will return to save the world. They might believe that. And again, the question is, should I trust them or not? The problem is that about these various recherche things that they're talking about, I don't know anything about it. So how can I evaluate that? Goldman gives us 5 methods to doing that. I think this is really a fantastic philosophy paper in that it takes a question that is of so clear, evident relevance to normal people, and uses philosophy and some sort of little mathematics to really tell us new, interesting things about that question, how to answer it. Which experts should we rely on? Okay, 5 methods. He just gives us 5 methods. Okay, first method he gives us. While we cannot normally evaluate the arguments that the experts give for their position directly, because we don't understand the evidence and we don't understand these methods that they use, he thinks we can consider how the apparent experts argue for their view and how they talk with the other apparent experts who disagree with, how they criticize arguments with the others. Okay. So I can't directly evaluate the experts' arguments since I don't know much about the relevant field. But what I can do is what Goldman calls indirect argumentative justification. So that one of the experts, one of the apparent experts, is the one that's more credible. So what are these? So, for example, suppose there's you're observing these experts for a while, and you see that generally the expert X seems to have a good response to Y's argument, but Y never really has a good response to X's argument. Now, you don't understand the details of these arguments, but it seems Y is just often, gets just really angry, or sort of doesn't say anything anymore, changes the subject, whereas X seems to have something to say. That's something that counts for something, Goldman thinks. Or, X can easily think about counterexamples, problems for his own view, but then comes up with interesting responses to them. It's fluid and interesting ways of responding to them. Again, that counts for something. Or think that X gives long, detailed arguments that appeal to very different kinds of sources, while Y just always returns back to the same talking point. It seems to have been drilled into him. Now, this may sound like this is like about rhetorics, about the style that they use, but that's not how Goldman understands this. He thinks that being an expert, a real expert, that has someone who has knowledge, or someone who has knowledge, and someone who has reliable methods finding out about this domain, being an expert in this sense has certain consequences. And we can rely here on inference to the best explanation. The best explanation for being able to do these various things is that you are actually an expert who knows that they are actually an expert who knows what they're talking about. So we can use these methods of indirect looking at the kind of arguments someone uses when they argue for their views to find out whether they are experts. Okay, that's the first. Second method. We can use the question of whether other experts agree with this one or not. Now, note that this is yet not something that Goldman defends fully, so we'll need to qualify it. We'll talk about this. Is the most difficult part of the lecture today, actually. Now, it seems that often we can consider how many people side with our two apparent experts. Okay, are most in agreement with this one, or most in agreement with the other one? So the most prominent example, climate science, where it's often argued that one important reason to believe that climate change, for example, is real is that the vast majority of experts believe that it is real. So we appeal to numbers. So look, it's just like an absolute overwhelming 98.9% of experts who think that one thing, and very, very small minority think something else. So we go with the numbers. But Goldman thinks that simply observing the numbers is not enough. It's not as simple as that. And I think that's a really important observation, and it takes a little bit of technicalities to get it right, to get it out, but I'll try to explain it to you. Okay. So here's a basic illustration why using the numbers is not always a good way to find out who the most credible expert is. Suppose that things work like this. There's two opinions, opinion A and opinion B. They're, in conflict. Okay. Now, suppose that somehow, suppose that the numbers are 7 versus 4. 7 people believe A and only 4 believe B. So the numbers would speak for opinion A. There's more expert on the one side than an expert on the other side. The problem is, though, that when it comes to opinion A, when we look at it, the way this field, the field that supports A, is structured is that there's one guru who has these views, and he just spreads it around, and he has his various slaves who just parrot whatever he says. They say whatever he says. And so there are a lot of people, because he's this very influential guru. But it seems like, well, the fact that he's an influential guru doesn't really, and creates a lot of slaves, that seems not to be such a good thing. That doesn't speak in favor of A rather than B, where we have a number of independent experts who all come to the conclusion that B is right. Just another way this sort of thing can happen is that you might have one person who spreads around rumors. It's not even a guru, it's not suppressing it, it's just spreads rumors, and somehow others carry those rumors along, and they spread out. And you create a lot of people who believe this thing, but they all trace back to this one person who spreads the rumors. And now Goldman tries to show now what the conditions exactly are when numbers should count and when they shouldn't count. This is where a lot of math comes in. Please do tell me if you have difficulties there, write to me, or we'll talk about it, of course, in our Zoom discussion. And if you cannot attend them, do get in contact with me or ask questions about it. Okay, so here's a little bit of math. So let's call H the hypothesis that the experts consider. Okay, post this H. So X and Y are two experts. We're going to write X of H for X believes the hypothesis H. The same for Y of H. Y of H, sorry, this should be Y of H, not X. And we'll write the probability, we write probability A / B for the probability of A given that B is true. Okay, so now we can make the following definitions. Two experts are conditionally independent if the probability, so especially Y is conditional independent of X, if the probability that Y believes the hypothesis, given that X believes it and the hypothesis is true, is greater than the probability that Y believes the hypothesis, given that X believes it and is not true. So in words, you can describe it as follows. The probability that the expert believes the hypothesis is affected by whether the hypothesis is true, even if you hold constant that X already believes it. So you sort of hold constant X believes it, then the only thing you vary is whether it's actually true. And if that affects the expert's view, then that counts. Then they are conditionally independent. While Y is called a non-discriminating reflector of X, if the probability that Y believes the hypothesis is not at all affected by whether the hypothesis is true, once we hold constant that X already believes it. Okay, so it's just parroting X. Okay, so now now we can go to the guru versus the independent experts again. Appealing to numbers is only going to be a good method to the degree to which experts are conditionally independent. If the experts are not conditionally independent, Goldman thinks, then the numbers shouldn't count, because then they can all, for example, trace back to the guru. Now, of course, you might ask, well, how do we know whether the experts are in fact conditionally independent? And I think Goldman thinks we can get some evidence for that. For example, does Y have a completely different root of evidence than X? I mean, is it maybe they do completely different research, but they come to the same conclusion? Does it look like Y just follows X uncritically, or does it look like he or she is actually evaluating the X's reasons? Is thinking about it? Do all the people who believe in this camp A, opinion A camp, do they all trace to the same source? Is there one source that they all raid? That's of the origins of all this, or is there independent roots for this? So we can get evidence, Goldman thinks, for whether the experts are conditionally independent or not. Now, I want you to do a little exercise here. Today, lots of people believe this QAnon conspiracy theory. And I want you to use the resources in this section, this method 2. Together, you can do some internet research if you don't know much about QAnon, to argue why the numbers should not count in this case. So the fact that lots of people believe it shouldn't count for anything, given the structure of the QAnon beliefs. Anyway, I think that one can make that argument, and I would want it would be great for you to make it. That would be a good way to think about these issues through. So method 3. Another thing we can use, even though we're not expert, to find out which experts are the good experts, is to use what is a quote from Goldman, appraisals by meta-experts. Meta-experts of the expert's expertise, or appraisals reflecting the official credentials of the experts. Okay, so does an expert, if the expert seems to be a decent expert, they have a PhD in the relevant field, they have a position at the well-regarded research institution, they publish regularly in peer-reviewed and high-ranked journals or books with high-ranked academic publishers in the field, their work gets cited substantially and often by others in the field. That seems to show, well, this person really seems to be an expert, a good expert, that we use sort of what others, their credentials. It's very hard to get cited so often by your peers if your work is really crap. Okay. Now, of course, these are not perfect criteria. As we'll talk about next week, some people's knowledge might be systematically neglected. There might be biases. Some people might be silenced. Some types of knowledge might never be heard. And so people don't get a PhD, or people's work doesn't get cited, not because it's not good, but because it gets systematically ignored. So well, this is important, but also dangerous method, because there might be some other reasons than expertise that explains why someone's work doesn't get cited. Okay, so we'll talk about that next week. Method 4. We can, again, quote, consider the expert's interest and biases vis-a-vis the question at issue. So in a really fantastic piece of work, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, they're historians of science, show how a fairly small number of scientists, they did have credentials, they had PhDs, they actually worked in quite a high level research institutions, how they systematically distorted public opinion on matters from the effects of tobacco on lung cancer to how to climate change and whether it's human made or not. And they systematically did that, and was systematically paid by and supported by the oil industry and the tobacco industry. And so what Goldman thinks we can do is look, when it comes to expert questions, who's paying the experts? Who is paying them? Where do they work? Are these independent research institutions, or are these private companies? What's the background? Are they really experts on this topic? Why might they be biased on this? Now, interesting cases for Norway, if we think about, for example, who are the experts in the salmon industry? Who's paying this? Maybe even the Research Council of Norway. Is the Research Council of Norway really independent on these issues? Might they not be interested in, since they're paid by the Norwegian government, to make sure that, for example, we don't find out that we just get rid of salmon fishing, or the oil industry is so bad. So maybe we're going to get people who are systematically biased because they're paid by the industry. Maybe there's a male biased field. Maybe there's people are biased. We know that gender bias is very pervasive. Okay. So what you can use is appeal to things that are known to be known biases, like people. It's known that people who work for companies that want a certain result, they tend to get that result. it's known that people have gender biases. So we can use those methods also to find out who might be biased here. Finally, we can use evidence of the experts' past track records. Now, have the experts' predictions turned out how they have to turn out in the past? Have they been successful in the past or not? Now, this immediately comes with the problem, though. Since I can't understand the evidence, I don't know anything about climate change science, for example, the details of it, the cancer research, economics, etc. I can't read any of these journal articles, so it seems like I don't know whether the predictions that I made in them were true or not, because I don't understand the evidence. So it seems like they can't really use a track record because I don't understand the evidence. But Goldman thinks sometimes we do have available solutions. So he distinguishes between esoteric knowledge that's inaccessible to the layperson and exoteric knowledge that's a way of presenting, or it's parts of the knowledge that are accessible. And sometimes, as time goes on, things that were published only in these specialist journals and only with the accessible with the specialist methods, they become accessible also to the layperson. He gives this kind of nice toy example. So right now, the hypothesis that there will be an eclipse of the sun on April 22, 2130 in a particular place, Santa Fe, that's something I can't judge. I mean, that seems to be a question of specialists in astrophysics. Where are the eclipses? That's not something I wouldn't know how to find it out. And no one else, none of the lay people right now do that. But of course, there comes a time at the end of April in the year 2130 where there are lots of lay people who can very easily find it out. They just need to look at the sky and they will immediately test whether that hypothesis that was only accessible to specialists in our year was true. So sometimes lay people are able to test the hypothesis in the future, even though they can't assess the evidence for it now. So that sometimes specialist knowledge can generate predictions that the layperson can assess. So, for example, some particular medical method, if we can assess how good the evidence for that, whether it's a good method, we can see, well, is it curing the diseases? That's something the layperson can judge, often, at least to some degree. Now, with regard to this current pandemic, the experts disagree on various methods for, say, curbing the spread of the virus. Something you can, to some degree, observe is, do the numbers go down when this thing is done, or how is it compared to some other thing? Now, of course, there's sometimes a problem for the layperson is that they might be having a very limited data set. They might have very few data that are available. Or if they have a lot of data, maybe that the experts have already presented the data to them in a way where it's hard to, where it's already one-sided. So there are problems again with this method. Anyway, it's a method that we can use to some degree. So summary of the 5 methods then. We can, when we try to find out which evidence, which experts, which apparent experts we should rely on, use first method, indirect argumentative evidence. How are they arguing with the opponents? Do they have a lot of independent reasons? Do they seem to be easily swayed by counterexamples? Seems to be returned just to the same talking point? Do they seem thoughtful about it? We can use numbers. How many is this? The vast majority of the experts is just one single person. There we need to be careful, and you also need to use conditional independence. Are these experts independent of each other, or are they all is their knowledge all tracing back to the same documents or the same guru? We can use meta experts and official credentials. So do they have a publication record on this? Do they get cited and so on? Method 4, we can use evidence regarding known sources of biases. So, for example, are these apparent experts working for a firm that has a stake in the outcome of this debate? Finally, we can use experts' past track records, that is, how well have their predictions turned out in the past, to predict how good the expertise is. So I think these are 5 interesting methods. We can talk about the various issues with them in a Zoom discussion or online. For now, that's it from me. Thanks, and you have reached the end.